Operation Rescue, an anti-abortion group, staged blockades of clinics in dozens of cities. In this war of symbols, the protests were designed to force arrests, and there were hundreds, from Washington, D.C. to Brookline, Massachusetts, and Detroit. In Los Angeles and other cities, protesters were matched by pro-choice counter-demonstrators.
Americans have a lot of choices that they're privileged to make. Murder is not one of them.
In New York, the head of Operation Rescue intensified the war of images with a coffin he said contained an aborted child. Pro-choice advocates stood before their symbol of illegal abortion.
Operation Rescue is not about love and compassion. Operation Rescue is about this. This will be the reality for women if their agenda succeeds.
In the end, each side accused the other of terrorism. The protests come as the Supreme Court considers a Missouri case that could overturn the 1973 ruling legalizing abortion. A decision may be returned this summer. But whatever the court decides, it is not likely to settle the issue in the streets of America.
Jesus loves the little children of the world.
Scott Pelley, CBS News, New York.
And there was a new development today in the story of baseball's Pete Rose, whose alleged gambling activities are under investigation. Frank Courier with details of that.
A source today confirms for CBS News that Cincinnati Reds manager Pete Rose has told Major League Baseball he was the victim of a blackmail attempt by an ex-friend who then lied to investigators about his gambling activities. Before a rain-delayed game with the Phillies, Rose refused comment on published reports that he is planning in his own defense to say bodybuilder Paul Jansen, now doing time for tax evasion, tried twice last winter to blackmail him for $40,000. Rose, sources say, is prepared to tell investigators he rebuffed Jansen, who then repeatedly threatened Rose through his friends. CBS News was told a list of those friends was turned over to authorities. Younger brother Dave Rose, who runs a Cincinnati restaurant, says Jansen, out for revenge, contrived the scandal about Rose betting on baseball games, including the Reds.
Paul had made a couple of phone calls to friends of Pete's and asked them to get a hold of Pete and that he was going to do what he was going to do.
Jansen, who has told investigators he acted as middleman, phoning in bets for himself and Rose, angrily denies the extortion plot, telling CBS News Pete will have his chance to talk and show his evidence, and so will I. A source close to Jansen says he can prove there was no attempted blackmail. With both baseball and federal authorities investigating the Cincinnati manager for illegal gambling and tax matters, Rose, if found guilty of betting on baseball, could be suspended for a year. But if he wagered on the Reds, he could be banned from the game for life. For the record, Rose will say only that he is cooperating with investigators, that he is not worried, and vows to tell his side of the story as soon as the baseball commissioner is ready to listen. Frank Courier, CBS News, Chicago.
By the way, Frank Courier will have more on the Pete Rose story tomorrow morning on the CBS News broadcast Sunday morning with Charles Carroll. For Oliver North, this was another day of waiting. North arrived at his office this morning as the jury in his Iran-Contra criminal trial deliberated for an 8th day. After about 3 hours, the jurors adjourned without reaching a verdict again, and they'll try again on Monday. This is President Bush's 100th day in office. For the most part, he's spending it quietly at the White House. His only public appearance, tonight's White House Correspondents' Dinner. Tomorrow, the president will observe the 200th anniversary of George Washington's inauguration in New York. Those festivities are already underway, as David Culhane reports.
The grand weekend of celebration started today with a parade of ships in New York Harbor. And workmen set the stage for the centerpiece, a reenactment tomorrow of the first inauguration. President Bush will fly in for the ceremony. 200 years ago, General George Washington traveled to New York at a slower pace from Mount Vernon, his home in Virginia. The actor who will play him tomorrow has done the same, trying all the while to recreate the image of the first president, an image that has become more and more complicated through the years.
Even before George Washington was inaugurated, his image began to change as people took a great man and idealized him more and more. The effort to understand who he really was continues to this day.
There was, of course, the warrior and great general, the patriot and statesman, almost deified in American art.
He's always been a distant, mystical figure, even more, for example, than Lincoln. I think it'll always remain that way.
But every generation has mined new truths about Washington's life, new understanding that the myth was also a very human man.
He was for a good many years in love with the wife of his neighbor and best friend.
One part of the image has always been true. He could have been a king, but preferred to be a president.
He didn't want power. He didn't want power.
I think he did invent the presidency. He was creating the first such nation in the history of the world. It was a tremendous invention.
In other words, the first
nation that was subject to the will of the people.
Today, school children know he was significant, although they sometimes confuse him with Columbus.
He discovered it? No, he didn't. He stopped the wars and fight, and he gave us freedom. The fall of our country.
The celebration is about the beginning of the first presidency, but it is really about the first president. Each new generation probes, and each generation finds again that he was indeed what the historians call the indispensable man. David Culhane, CBS News, New York.
And still ahead on tonight's CBS Evening News, the Pope goes to the island nation of Madagascar, and later a toast to the TV at 50. Harry Smith says, here's looking at you.
Trying to close the big sale with dirty dentures?
I just soaked them.
Soaking's not enough. Denture Cream cleans almost twice as clean as effort into 90 seconds.
Cleaner and faster.
Brush with Denture Cream or Minty Denture Gel.
Time to eat. Hey, if you wear dentures, I'll bet you know what it's like getting food stuck between your dentures and gums. Like this darn seed. Ouch. But Super Polygrip forms a seal so tight it can hold from morning till night. To help keep food out, dentures in. Super Polygrip.
Fat chance. Finding a faucet made as well as a price fister. After all, it's the one made in its own USA foundry. The one uniquely fashioned with a heart of solid brass. Start to finish, the quality is first rate. Furthermore, the cost is a fraction of what you'd expect. So why fiddle around? Get a price fister. The fabulous faucet with a funny name.
Now at Red Lobster, one great thing deserves another and another. Introducing our great seafood trios. For a limited time, find 6 new trios starting at $7.95. More of everything you crave. Like 3 great tastes of lobster, a new trio of shrimp and crab. Something for everyone. Starting at just $7.95. Kids' dinner, $1.95. Don't miss the great seafood trios at Red Lobster. And get a half pound of snow crab legs for just $3.95 with any entree.
Senior officials in China gave in today and held their first talks with representatives of striking students. The officials apparently made no headway at all, and strike leaders openly ridiculed the meeting. John Sheehan now is in Beijing.
Chinese government officials met with 45 university students in an effort to end the week-old strike at Beijing colleges. Though most of the students invited were hand-picked members of Communist Party-run student organizations, it turned into an extraordinary free-for-all. The students demanded democracy, a free press, and accused the country's leaders of widespread official corruption. Even more extraordinary, the 3.5-hour debate was broadcast later today on national television. But the government representatives had conceded little and told the students to go back to their classes. The newly elected president of the Independent Student Union, 21-year-old Wu R. Kai-shi, and most of his associates boycotted the session. The independents are threatening more street demonstrations unless communist authorities negotiate with them. With 70,000 students idle, one aim of the government is to convince the Chinese public that officials have opened a genuine dialogue with the students, following last Thursday's 15-hour march that brought more than 150,000 protesters into the streets and won wide approval from ordinary Chinese working people. Tonight, in a parking lot press conference, the elected student leaders denounced the televised debate as a sham. The dissident students vowed that the strike will continue. The coming week will test who has more credibility on the campuses, the government-sponsored student organizations or the rebels. John Sheehan, CBS News, Beijing.
Pope John Paul spent his first full day today in the African island nation of Madagascar, in a country where most of the people practice ancestor worship. John Paul was obliged to alter his traditional message, and Alan Pizzig reports.
The Pope's first public church service in Madagascar swayed to a distinctly African rhythm today, and that was appropriate. The theme of this first leg of his four-country African tour is enculturation, Vatican shorthand for blending local traditions with the principles of Catholicism. Priests have been finding it increasingly difficult to persuade converts to abandon local customs such as polygamy and trial marriages. But the presence of John Paul II drew more than 20,000 people to the airport at the northern tip of this island, which was probably most of the local population. The church has won considerable support by speaking out against some of the country's ills, including official-level corruption. The Pope referred to that issue only obliquely. What he did say in a message to youth was that Christianity had not come to Madagascar to replace one religion with another. Evangelism, he said, does not seek to erase tradition. More than half of the people here still practice traditional or animist religions, and in rural areas especially, life is ordered by a complex array of local taboos and customs. The Pope told his bishops here that evangelism had to be combined with enculturation. To some extent, at least, that has already happened. Communion doesn't sound quite like this in St. Peter's. Alan Pizzig, CBS News, Antsiranana, Madagascar.
Saudi Arabian salvage crews today refloated an Indian supertanker that spilled about 1 million gallons of oil after hitting a reef in the Red Sea. One expert warns that the spill could harm turtle breeding grounds.
Some cereals turn into flavorless mush and milk.
Action today from Dick Cheney, the new Secretary of Defense. He's quoted as saying that Soviet leader Gorbachev probably will fail in his efforts to reform the Soviet economy, and that if he does fail, he'll probably be replaced eventually by a leader who is less willing to make accommodations to the West. For our Washington Notebook segment tonight, to talk about that and other things, we're joined from Washington by the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Dante Fascell. Mr. Chairman, let me start right there. Sort of an unexpected statement by Mr. Cheney. Do you share that view?
Well, I think it's a realistic assessment. Gorbachev has an awesome task. In our conversations that we had, I raised that same issue. I said, you haven't been able to do much in 40 years. You're really not going to change the system. And he's not. He believes in a centralized system. And I doubt that any improvements around the fringes will really make the kind of changes that are going to be necessary. So there's going to have to be a lot more done in terms of restructuring that society in order to bring about the efficient economy that Gorbachev envisions. So I'd have to say right now, I agree with Secretary Cheney that the chances are that this will be a very difficult task, if not impossible.
Well, I guess the obvious question is then, what does that mean for U.S.-Soviet relations? Are we on the right track here in our approaches to Mr. Gorbachev?
Oh, absolutely. There's no question about it, because he's demonstrated here with the purge in the party committee that he has good political control. He's prepared to go forward with his initiatives, and they present both an opportunity and a challenge for us, of course. And we should take that opportunity as long as he's changed his global vision with regard to the expansion of the Soviet international policy. Absolutely, we ought to take advantage of it.
Let me ask you a little bit about what's going on in NATO right now. The Germans seem to want to start negotiations immediately on what to do about short-range missiles that are based in Europe. The United States and Mrs. Thatcher over in Britain say that this is not a good time to do that. What does this mean for NATO? Are we about to have a rupture between the NATO allies here, and what does that mean?
No, I don't think we'll have a rupture, but certainly, and we've had differences of opinion before in NATO. After all, we're all independent sovereign countries, but there's more need for NATO now than there ever was. with all of the changes that are taking place in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. So if we do have a dispute, and we do, we have a real honest difference of opinion with regard to a 000 option in Europe. The Britons, Great Britain and the United States are supporting modernization and the maintenance of nuclear weapons on the battlefield as part of our flexible response. The German government sees it otherwise. And so to ease things off, and there's going to be a lot of discussion, Margaret Thatcher is just the lead in this discussion right now. There'll be a lot of discussion before this issue's settled.
But you think, Mr. Chairman, that eventually it will be settled and NATO will hold together?
I think it has to. No question about it.
All right. Thank you very much. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back in just a moment with more news.
Oh, boy, fruit and fiber.
No, it's new fruit and fiber.
Beg your pardon?
Mm-hmm. Well, you see, they added 25% more dates, raisins, and walnuts to the dates, raisins, and walnuts. So now it's the great tasting fruit and fiber.
Just because they added more dates, raisins, and walnuts doesn't change the name. It's still fruit and fiber.
No. Matter of fact, it's so delicious, they should call it fruit and fruit and fruit and fruit and fiber.
New Post Fruit and Fiber cereal, now with 25% more dates, raisins, and walnuts.
With its 24-valve V6 engine, double overhead cams, and 220 horsepower, the new Ford Taurus SHO isn't for everyone. In fact, only a select number will experience this sport interior and performance suspension. The new limited production Ford Taurus SHO. Power in the hands of a fortunate few.
Get 2.9% financing or $750 cash bonus on 89 Ford Taurus.
Ready?
In a minute, honey.
It's nice to be noticed for what you wear and how you look. And if you wear dentures, it's nice to know Efferdent freshens up dentures and cleans away stains so well. With Efferdent, all they'll notice is you.
Gas pain, bloating. Gas-X has the strongest, fastest relief ingredient. Painful gas is like beer bubbles. Add the leading antacid. Add Gas-X. Only Gas-X gets rid of the gas. The strongest, fastest reliever for gas pain and bloating. Gas-X.
Thousands attended a memorial service in Liverpool today for the victims of Britain's worst sports tragedy. Prime Minister Thatcher and members of the royal family watched as candles were lit for each of the dead. 95 fans of the Liverpool soccer team were trampled or crushed to death 2 weeks ago at a game in Sheffield. 3 major British store chains said today they're pulling baby food made by U.S.-owned H.J. Heinz and a leading British producer. It is the latest development in a growing tampering scare. Anthony Mason now with that story.
14-month-old Matthew Cookson cries in the arms of a British hospital nurse after swallowing a sliver of glass. Across Britain, more than 300 people have now reported finding glass pins or needles in baby food jars of the country's 2 largest suppliers, Heinz and Cow & Gate. So far, there have been no serious injuries, and British police believe most of the cases are the work of copycats or false alarms. But Scotland Yard admits the scare was triggered by an extortionist. British police say Heinz received several extortion demands beginning in late March. The blackmailer's price, $1,700,000. Heinz has refused to pay and resisted withdrawing its baby food products.
This man can come back again tomorrow, next day, next week, next month. It will not solve the problem in withdrawing the product.
But the British press started a drumbeat to clear the shelves, and parents have lost their patience.
Because they are playing Russian roulette with our babies' lives. That's what it boils down to. So how many...
Friday, Heinz and Cow & Gate finally agreed to redesign their packages, but it will be weeks before they reach the stores. Critics are making embarrassing comparisons.
The authorities and manufacturers in the United States act very differently in similar crises.
British newscasts have noted Tylenol's quick decision in 1982 to pull its stock and change its packaging.
Why on earth hasn't the British baby market benefited from the US experience of dealing with crazy people making demands through baby stomachs?
With the extortionists still loose and the scare spreading, many stores have stopped waiting for the companies to act. This weekend, they're clearing the shelves themselves. Anthony Mason, CBS News, London.
finally, we want to take note of an anniversary of sorts tonight. It was 50 years ago this month that the first scheduled television broadcasts were made from the New York World's Fair. Harry Smith has been good enough to put together a little TV news report about it, and here it is.
Toughest battles into sound. There are none other than billionaire.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is my third television show of the season.
Good evening, television consumers.
Since the days when television really became a mass medium and TV started popping up in homes all over the country, Americans have had a hard time figuring out just what place television should take in their homes and in their lives.
Well, television occupied a very, a sort of a tentative status in people's homes, at least at the outset.
Even early on, some folks found our love of television a little embarrassing. Why else would the TV makers put doors in front of the screen?
People still were not quite sure of its place in their lives, and you can tell that by the place that they put it in their living rooms.
The appliance we know as television has always made a lousy piece of furniture. Living rooms and parlors had to be rearranged to make space for this thing that so many of us were suddenly rearranging our lives around.
Don't be ridiculous.
What do you mean, ridiculous? I'll get out there and show you.
Go ahead.
All right. For that life-size window on the world, see Dumont.
Yet, when the first TV arrived in a neighborhood or years later when we found out someone we knew had a color set, it was a time of envy and excitement. The owners were proud and all of us were amazed at the technological miracle at our fingertips.
There is no secret club. Please remove that cap.
The early ads told us TV was going to bring our families together. Soon, the sociologists were telling us TV was keeping our families apart. We shared the same screen, they said, but we stopped talking to each other. TV did the talking instead. When we did talk, we argued about who would watch what, when. As TV got more popular and the sets got smaller, the arguments disappeared as we each disappeared to be with our own set in our own place.
And since that time, television has become the environment in which we live.
No, the big box doesn't dominate our living rooms like in the old days, nor does television dominate our lives like then. Although in the average American household, the television stays on at least 4 hours a day. That's still a lot for any appliance, or for that matter, a piece of furniture. Harry Smith, CBS News, New York.
That's the news. Connie Chung will be here tomorrow. Later tonight on West 57th, the case of a convicted murderer who the Russians say is an American political prisoner. I'm Bob Schieffer, CBS News in New York. Good night.
Can the Cavs deflate Air Jordan? Can the Celtics detour Detroit? Can the Blazers dethrone L.A.? It's time to rock and roll.
This is CBS.
Up next, only